Me too. Me too. Me too. Me too. Me too. If all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. Were you on Facebook yesterday or this morning and noticed this was the status posted by a large chunk of women on your friends list? I woke up this morning to see that so many women posted this as their status the day before. Now, I didn't check social media yesterday and I had missed it, but I explained that and posted it to my Facebook as well. I think it's important to bring any awareness to the fact that it's happened to you too. So I copied and pasted it, and if you have been sexually harassed or assaulted, I really hope that you did too. My only problem with it is that it does clearly say women rather than person or people, because I do know that it's happened to men too. Maybe not as much, but it does happen. I think also that most of the stories I've heard of it happening to a man, the majority of the time it's another man doing it, but it still happens. I'm probably not as educated as I should be to talk about this subject, but that is, once again, just my opinion. This awareness is being fueled by the Harvey Weinstein scandal, and within Hollywood, a lot of women and men have also come forward about messed up things that have happened to them. I think that maybe it could happen more often in Hollywood to men, but my mind has been filled with thoughts of bullying and inappropriate things that happens to everyone, boys and girls, men and women, etc., etc. How did it make you feel to see the amount of people that this has affected? Did it make you mad, sad? I mean, like it should have. My first memory of sexual harassment, or assault, I guess it would have been called, was when I was 14 years old. Now, I have blocked out the majority of my life before the age of 14, but this is the first memory I do have of it, and I have many more after it being an industry that I've worked in, many more minor things, but this was probably the first really bad thing that happened. I was at a party at my friend's house. There were a few of us in a bedroom upstairs, and I really can't remember what happened, but everyone ran downstairs to see something. It was probably someone doing something stupid, I mean, as middle school age teens do. And this guy, his name was Matt, he grabbed my hand and said, "Hold on, I want to show you something." I didn't think anything of it in that moment, but before I knew it, he had me on my friend's bed and was trying to pull my jeans off of my body. I was lucky. One of the guys ran back upstairs. He had forgotten, like, his lighter or something. And he burst in the door and was like, "Oh, shit, sorry." And Matt jumped off of me. I jumped up, pulled my pants back up, and ran out of the bedroom. I went home right away. No one ever talked about this incident. I didn't talk about it. They didn't talk about it. And I didn't go to another party with that group of people for a very, very long time. I was a virgin when this happened. And I stayed a virgin for a few years after that, barely touching or allowing anyone to touch me. I can definitely say that it ruined a few things for me and inside of me. And it also stopped me from exploring sexually at that age, as most of my friends were doing, if not all of my friends. I am happy that I waited, but it makes me sad to think about the reason that I waited. If you're wondering what happened to Matt, the guy who tried to rape me, he's dead. I knew that he had died, but I never really cared to learn how. Thinking about all of this today, I did a little investigating, and I also reached out to an old friend of mine because I knew that he would know. He told me what happened. I looked up the news stories, and it's true. He got burned to death in his car. It is believed it was targeted in a gang-related incident. It's a pretty messed up way to die. But I couldn't help but think that it also said a lot for the person that he was, as messed up as that also feels to say. But something else that is messed up is the fact that I dismissed his actions for so many years, and so did others. He successfully raped other girls after this happened between us. And again, I had heard things, but never stepped forward or told my story of him, because I didn't feel like it was really that important. And that is how so many people feel about their stories, that they aren't important. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, you should tell your story. It's about time that something more was done about this.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agree or Disagree, the podcast. It is Kevin Olenek. You can find me on Facebook as a friend, Kevin Olenek. You can like Agree or Disagree, the podcast on Facebook. You can follow me on Twitter at KEVOLE. You can listen to all of my podcasts on Spreaker.com, KEVOLE. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, Kevin Olenek, and subscribe on iTunes, Agree or Disagree, the podcast. And this is the fourth time that we have done a conversation on this podcast about the Me Too conversation. And each time, I have started with the same story, and it's Alexis's story. There are many other stories, but I always choose to start this story because it's a reminder of the many stories that are out there. With Me Too, there has also been another movement that has came up. It's called church.That. And according to many users, the church.That movement started near the end of November and is traced to two women, a writer named Hannah Paasch and a spoken word poet named Emily Joy. It has been in response to the issue inside the church, that for some there has been a shroud of secrecy, silence, and abuse of biblical power on this. For others, many leaders, such as Franklin Graham, Denny Burk, and an even newer voice called the conservative millennial named Allie Beth Stuckey has said.
Yeah, so as a Christian, I believe that the world is broken. I believe in inherent sin ever since the fall of man, that we are all broken and we're all in need of reconciliation to God through Jesus. And because of that, we see all kinds of brokenness, not just in the Me Too movement, but in anything that is less than perfect, because people are imperfect. And so the Me Too movement is simply a symptom of that brokenness, as well as I think our trend as a society in America to get further and further away from the family, further away from the values that we used to hold dear.
It has also opened the door to some questions and anger, but it's also kind of actually led to a shrug for many as well. Why? Because there seems to be no change for many in the church. They don't expect anything different. They expect the same comments. But we also know that there are many leaders trying to navigate through this. And three of them are our guests today. First, we have Kevin Powell. He is the pastor of the First Lutheran Church in Calgary. He is the president of Alberta Pastoral Care, the association. He is an opera nerd. He is a Blue Jays fan. Hello, Kevin.
Hello.
How are you today?
I am well. How are you?
Good. Also, Nicholas Coates. He describes himself as bearded and balding. He is a writer, a minister, a mediocre dodgeball player. He is a co-host of Prayer in Private Parts, a podcast about sex and Jesus. He also is in Calgary as well. Hello, Nicholas.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And we also have the Reverend, and I hope I mispronounced your last name. I do apologize here. Keiko. Sorry about that. Oops. I'm really sorry. Sorry. A second here. Sorry, something came. I'm so sorry. Yeah, sorry. We have the Reverend Keiko Dreger-Hessine. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
It's Dreger-Hessline.
Dreger-Hessline. I'm so sorry. I was looking for that on there. Sorry, I had a note issue there. Pastor of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada with a Jewish American husband, 2 sons, a PhD in systematic theology and an allied field in history from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. Currently the interim pastor at Advent Calgary and also teaches theology at an adjunct faculty member at the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Saskatoon. And my tongue is tied. But thank you for joining us.
No problem. Hi.
Hi. I think maybe the start this conversation is to maybe get your reaction or your thoughts around Me Too, church.That. Has it changed your approach to ministry or kind of what are your thoughts? Kind of just open up kind of what you are thinking about as we talk about this.
Well, I know for me, the stories that are coming out in Me Too and church.That are not new to me. I have had congregation members tell me various things like this over the course of the last 16 years. But what I find is new is that they're willing to be more public about these conversations, and they're willing they're actually asking to hear more about me preaching on this issue from the pulpit.
Really?
Yeah, there's been, when the Me Too movement first broke, I sort of tangentially mentioned it in a sermon. And after that, a number of people sort of came up to me and spoke. And I had mentioned that I was working on a research paper for a Lutheran publication about church silence around sex abuse. And they had asked me, can I read it? Can we talk about this in church? And so since then, I've sort of been, I've talked about it more in sermons and also with our confirmation class. We teach grade 7 and grade 8 students, and we look at the Bible and we look at all the rules of the church, and they're a very aware group of kids. They understand that there are parts of the Bible that speak against women, and they're very sensitive to that. So when the issue does come up in confirmation class, we talk about it. What does it mean? What does sex abuse not what does it look like, but what does the church's response to that look like? And we talk about how it's not right. And the young people are frustrated by the silence they hear.
Kevin, Nicholas?
Yeah, this past summer I was... Sorry?
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
Okay, this past summer, I was preaching on a sermon series on the biblical figure of David, and his encounter with Bathsheba came up, and used the term encounter, perhaps not the best word, because there was a power imbalance. David was the king, and Bathsheba was a married woman to one of his soldiers who was fighting for him, and they had a sexual encounter. And there is evidence that due to the power relationship, that this was in actuality a rape. And I used that as an entryway into talking about the Time's Up and Me Too stuff. And I got thinking about that. I've preached on that narrative a few times, and I never went in that direction, but I felt compelled to go in that direction because of what was happening both in the media and happening in people's lives and experience. And I would say I felt freer to do it now, and I got some positive responses to that one. No negative ones, which I found really interesting, because I think previously, if I started naming that thing in a sermon, I would get negative responses, mainly because people don't want to be confronted with those sorts of issues, especially the Me Too stuff. And my congregation is somewhat on the conservative side of the spectrum, and I would get some of our older members, for example, would say, well, the Me Too stuff is just, creating problems for men, as it were. You're putting men in vulnerable positions and that sort of thing. And I think, well, this is kind of the point. To think about our culpability within people's, especially women's and girls, their own sexuality and their own sexual vulnerability. And what do we do, and not just in specific violent ways, but also in ways that encourage that kind of culture around us. And so when I got preaching on that and talking about David being a rapist, I think that brought to the forefront a conversation that we're finally allowed to have, we're able to have, that's come from outside of us, come from the broader culture through media and people being freer to talk about this sort of thing. So, and in my personal ministry, I found that there's been ways that people have been talking to me about these sorts of things has changed in the last few years. In fact, they are able to talk about it now. And I think that's a very positive step.
Nicholas?
I think for me, I'd echo a lot of what my colleagues have said. For us, it's unfortunately nothing new. And whether it's, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, or sexual abuse, these conversations have existed in certainly my community, mainly in past congregation, but also I know in a lot of the lives of the people I minister to and their friends and family. And the MeToo movement and Church Too has given a permission and maybe a boldness for them to want to speak, but also to recognize that if we're a church that's supposed to care for each other, and if we're a church that's supposed to look at our world and ask, how does our faith respond to these things? It's made for a lot of conversations around what does Jesus say about this? What does the Bible say? How are we supposed to hold it? How are we supposed to respond as a church? And how does this shape how we act as individuals? And so it's been really challenging in a lot of ways, but also really inspiring to see people want to talk about these things and go into some really difficult conversations that this movement has prompted, and just ask, what does our faith offer us as people who are supposed to be following in the way of Christ?
It's interesting too, because with your podcast, I imagine like your one of your taglines is basically the conversations that we should be having in church, but don't. It sounds like you're getting maybe more of a surprising response to this than you thought. And
since we started the podcast, what we're both always surprised at is how much people want to talk about these taboo subjects, these everyday things that we kind of hold at an arm's distance, especially when it comes to church, because it's too difficult. The Bible's too challenging. What do we say about it? But since bringing it up in small groups and even on Sundays, there's definitely not an embrace, but I think a willingness from people, especially women, especially younger women, to let's talk about this as a community, and let's talk about this boldly, not just because it's happening in the world around us, but because this is stuff that we think about on a daily basis that happens to us, and we don't really know, and we're never really taught how to think about it and how to hold it. And they're looking for some, I think, guidance from church leaders about how to think about this and how to deal with it.
And I would add that it's not just the younger women. I'm finding in my experience that there's women who've been lifelong churchgoers who are 80 or 90 and want to talk about this. And I don't know, I'm curious if there are gender dynamics at play with whether or not the pastor is a man or a woman, and whether or not the fact that I am a woman has allowed some of these older women to feel freer to speak.
Yeah, I wonder if that's true. I've been the people who have been talking to me about this. They've been older women as well. However, it's usually they pull me into a corner and sit and tell me these stories in hushed tones. And I wonder if I don't know if the gender dynamics play into that, but I found it interesting the way they feel that they feel comfortable to tell me, but have to tell me in almost a hidden way. So they are comfortable talking about it, but not to the point of opening it up to a broader community conversation.
See, the age-old debate around the biblical rules that's been going on forever. It will continue to go on. I've solved it in my head, but I mean, there's still so many that debate have had that's continuing the debate. Has that changed in the church? Do you see a shift there, or and how has that impacted kind of what has happened in sort of the shroud of secrecy?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Sorry. I guess basically kind of the age-old debate around the biblical role of what the role of the man is and the role of the woman is in the church. And from your mind, are we shifting away from that conversation more? Is it something that is still there?
Yeah, I think Keiko can answer this question probably better than I can. But to start things off, I think the conversation's ongoing. There's been some positive changes, but I think there's still a lot of work to do and ways to go, because there's a lot of structures still in place that put women in traditional roles, especially if the female clergy person, the relationship, the women's group, that sort of thing. Just the way that the expectations of women versus men, I think, are still there. I don't know, Keiko, I'm guessing you have a lot to say on this.
Well, I do find it interesting. In the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, we've been ordaining women since 76, I think. So quite a long time. No, maybe not. 35 years. And so 50% of rostered leaders are women, but only 30% of active full-time clergy are women. So there's definitely a desire and sort of this narrative being portrayed that we are, the Lutheran Church is equal, we do have ordained women, but the reality is that that's not happening in practice. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of larger things to look at in terms of what the expectations are for women, whether they're full-time or pastime pastors. When I was in a congregation in Toronto, I had my first child, and that was 12 years ago, and there was still no maternity leave policy for pastors. Mm-hmm. We, as a church, as a national church, only got an actual parental leave policy, I think 2 or 3 years ago. So there's definitely what Kevin is saying about the traditional expectations. They're still there under the surface, even though our system and our ideals might tell us something different.
Mm-hmm. And there was a point that half of our bishops were women, and our national bishop presently is a woman. But at the same time, fewer women are in like senior pastor positions. More men are in overseeing staff and that sort of thing. And so those not little things, but those things are there that show that there is that the disparity still exists.
Nicholas, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think within my tradition in the United Church, we've been ordaining women since, I'd have to look it up, a long time. Over half of our churches are led by women. But where my thought went to is it's not just in leadership that we experience this tension. It's also within lay people involvement. And there's still a lot of assumptions that if you're a woman in the United Church, you go join the hospitality team, you make the coffee, you do these quote unquote traditional gender roles, and the men, you handle the finances, you handle the board, you handle the higher leadership positions. And that's something that we still run into, of trying to get equality in place for all our positions, and trying to make sure that we have gender equality and on our board, and encourage the congregation to move there along with us.
The conversations that you're having with your colleagues outside of this, what are those conversations like around these topics? What are you hearing? Are you hearing, like, is the church to MeToo kind of creating a shift within other communities, or like, is it called for a different response? What are your thoughts?
Amongst my colleagues, I hear two different responses that's actually dependent upon the generation. I do find that my younger colleagues are very much aware that this is going on and very much wanting to talk about this in the congregation. And from the older colleagues, so those who are sort of almost retired or just retired, there's more of a sense of just kind of radio silence. That this is just, there's lots of other things to talk about in the church, and there are. I mean, there are lots of things to talk about, but that this is not a pressing concern for them to address. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if models of pastoral authority that have been sort of embedded in seminary teaching and in the culture of the church. But I do notice a generation gap.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Keiko. Also, not just generation gap, but depends who I'm talking to in terms of what tradition they're coming from. Some of my colleagues from more conservative traditions, it's less of a priority, and it's some are even hostile towards it. I think mainly because many conservative denominations uphold traditional gender roles, and they see the MeToo movement as a way of taking away male authority, which they see as being its rightful place. And so they have difficulty coming to terms with it. Also, when they say they can't, they downplay it, say, "Oh, it can't be that widespread," and then they'll saw about, well, what about the women and the false accusations, that sort of thing, as a way of diminishing the power that the MeToo movement has, and that needs, and it's actually having on society. And in doing so, again, it's just maintaining traditional power structures that are inherently male.
Yeah, I think the conversations that I've been having and hearing about it's how do we as leaders bring this conversation into the church in more ways that's simply from the pulpit or in small groups, but how do we, in male-dominated churches, bring the voice of women in? And how do we look at our hymns that we sing and make sure that the theology that we sing is in line with the values that we uphold? When we look at the text that we preach, are we doing a good job of being representative of the women in the Bible? Are we actually dealing with the hard text? And so I think there's a willingness from a lot of my colleagues, but also a general disease with doing that maybe just comes from being overwhelmed, and also a struggle of how do we make this not just an American issue, but how do we show and teach people that this is a Canadian issue as well?
Do you think that people are thinking this is an American issue?
The conversations I've had with some people, they wonder if it's an American thing. That's not really happening up here in Canada, because I think the bulk of our news comes from American sources, so they haven't yet quite made the shift, some of them at least, to see that this is something that we need to talk about up here in Canada, because Church too is happening in our own cities and neighborhoods.
And I would say that, it sounds like the Lutheran Church is doing really well, but what we don't talk about, and we still are not talking about this, is the issue of clergy sexual abuse in the church. Mm-hmm. There is definitely a silence about that, and even amongst the younger pastors, a real reluctance to talk about how in our own tradition, there are pastors who have committed sexual abuse within congregations. And part of that, I think, is a fear. When you're a younger pastor, you don't want to say anything that could jeopardize your future career. But there is definitely, that is not a conversation that is happening publicly.
Agreed.
How I can imagine there is a lot of difficulty bringing that forward in a very wise and almost not necessarily in an over-confrontational way, but it is something that has to be confronted. How do you have suggestions on how that can be approached?
Well, for me, I don't think it's an issue of, like you said, it's not about confronted. I think the way I try to do it pastorally within a congregation is to start with these conversations about sex abuse, and also to talk about issues of power and the abuse of power. And I also preached about David and Bathsheba, and Kevin, I'm glad to hear that you did the same thing. And I talked about how that was an egregious abuse of power, and I talked about issues of consent and how Bathsheba could not ever possibly have given meaningful consent to David. Mm-hmm. And so I've apologized from the pulpit for other pastors who have abused their authority, in a sense saying, on behalf of pastors, we've all abused our authority, and I apologize and I confess. And my hope is that by doing that and by creating a climate where we can have these conversations, that people in the congregations will feel supported when they begin to speak up. Because I'm very mindful that these are not my stories to tell. I cannot tell victim stories unless they ask me to. So I have to create an atmosphere when victims do decide to speak, that they will know that I support them, that the leadership supports them, that just the whole church culture is supporting them.
I think that's really well put. I'd say that we try to create a culture that's safe and creates permission for people to do that, but also be intentional about to choose what we preach and to bypass some of the resistance that's, this is church, we don't talk about that kind of stuff here, by going to those stories of David and Bathsheba and others that talk about rape, that talk about power dynamics, and go into the life of Christ and say, this is the kind of stuff that Jesus is talking about, and we need to talk about here because this is the kind of stuff that we're actually about. And by creating that sense of awareness that, this is spiritual issues, and therefore we need to talk about this, I think we can create some space to raise those conversations and hopefully create a safe space for people to come in and get help and even share their stories.
So the question is leading me to talk a little bit and getting into the scriptural part of this, because on one hand, you'll have some that will say the Bible doesn't really talk about this kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, there's going to be some people out there that are going to say that, and you've heard it, that the Bible in some senses condones this stuff. So if someone is asking you somewhere where to start in Scripture about this, and Nicholas, you guys have been talking about the hard text. Kind of talk to us about some of those hard texts that people need to be looking at from both sides, really. Where do you point them to?
I'm having a difficult time answering this question because there's not a lot of places. I think, so people do come to me and they ask me that. And one of the things that I sort of respond with is, in the Lutheran tradition, at least, and I know it is true in other traditions, we have more than one source of revelation of God. We have the Bible, but we also have our experience and we also have our traditions. And one of the things that we have learned in the past 30, 40, 50 years since the rise of the second wave feminism is that women's experiences aren't in the Bible, not very much. And so the best way to hear God's voice is to just go and talk to other women right now, to start with that, and then go back to the Bible.
Mm-hmm. And also, I've been really heartened by ways people, especially our friends in the United States, are using the Bible around the Brett Kavanaugh stuff that's happening, right now, such as the first women declaring the risen Jesus weren't believed. Mary wasn't believed. These words seem to them an idle tale. Pulling these parts of Scripture to talk about a very real and immediate situation, I think it is really important. Also to look at the stories that were the difficult ones, such as the David and Bathsheba, such as the Judges 19, where a woman gets chopped up and mailed to the 12 tribes of Israel. And there are some really awful texts where where women are treated just horribly. And to recognize that they're there. About 2 years ago, I preached a sermon series called Bible Behaving Badly, because I wanted to touch on some of these, because there's two things happening. One is that some people think that the Bible is just a bunch of lovely, meaningful stories, timeless, heartfelt wisdom, and the other one is that people just see the Bible as being just this barbaric piece of literature that should have been tossed away from years ago. But we've been living with these stories for more than 2,000 years, and they have shaped Western culture. And there's some really awful stories in there. And with my Lutheran tradition, the operating interpretational principle of law and gospel, look at where the law is hitting us, such as the law meaning that which is condemning us, and the gospel is that which is forgiving us and setting us free. And people can read the same text and experience both as law or as gospel, such as in the book of James, where James goes off on rich people. Folks who are economically disadvantaged can read that and hear it as gospel. Rich people get angry at it and hear it as law. That's where it's coming from. So when we say point someone to the Bible, to a specific text, well, you can do that, but that's not the whole story. As Keiko says, your own experience is there as well, as a form of revelation and a form of interpretation. And so when people are engaging the scriptures, it's important to help them find a way to make those scriptures their own and interpret it according to their own life and experience.
And there's another story, Kevin, now that you said that, it just occurred to me. In the Old Testament, when Hannah is in the temple praying for a child and Samuel accuses her of being drunk. Yeah.
There's also the Esther text. We go on, where she saved the Jews from annihilation. There's a whole bunch we can talk about, but again, these stories need to be placed within the context of our own experience and learning how to interpret it according to our own experience, as opposed to just a story just sitting there, just being a story that's not speaking to anyone.
The next question that leads me to this is God. And I don't know what to ask here specifically. I mean, there's a number of things swirling in my head. Like, where is God in the midst of this? The character of God, all of that sort of stuff. And it's not an easy conversation to bring God into this, because when you say this, it just, because of history and everything else, it just brings a lot of different emotions to it. So talk about that perspective and talk about God in the midst of this. I guess that's the best way that I could put it. God in the midst of this.
Well, I think you just nailed it. God is in the midst of this. Our own tradition would tell us that God is there with the suffering. God always takes the side of the poor and the suffering, and away from the side of the powerful and the rich. So what I say, what is God doing? Where's God in all this? I think what God is doing is opening our eyes to a problem that's been there for a long time and asking us to do something about it, at long last. And I think God is both challenging, condemning, as well as giving us an opportunity to renew ourselves, to find resurrection in a new way of relating to one another, where these sorts of behaviors are no longer acceptable or pushed under the rug, that we can learn to set people free from all this and have a new way of relating.
And I think in addition to that, it's important not to be afraid to say that God is angry.
Yeah.
One of the things that I teach the confirmation students as part of trying to create this culture is that anger is often our response to injustice. Whether the injustice is real or not, that's one of our responses, and that there is a deep injustice here, and that it's okay for us to imagine and to believe that in our anger, God is angry alongside of us.
Yeah, I think I'd echo both of those and add that while God is also in our midst, we also have a God who moves ahead of us. And in this time, ask, where is God calling us to go? And how do we participate in that? Well, what kind of reflection, what kind of movements do we have to begin to take to move ourselves in our world where God is trying to take us? And that's going to involve some really difficult reflection and work on our part. But as God moves towards justice and moves towards healing, that's what we're called to do.
So when you hear...
And I do particularly like the Ecclesiastes text, where there's a time to tear down and a time to build up.
Yeah.
And I think, as as Christians, we have that structure to talk about things dying in order for there to be new life. Mm-hmm. And certainly to talk about our current systems being torn down, as painful and as destructive as that is, that it is, the result of it is new life.
Yeah, and how do we trust in resurrection?
In a way, I think the secular culture isn't.
Say that again, sorry?
I said I think we're equipped to talk about that in a way that the rest of the world isn't. We have a framework and a narrative and vocabulary already built in to talk about tearing down and building up and death and new life that is unique to Christians. We can claim that.
Yeah, well put.
Did I hear in what way? No? Okay. I'm just reflecting on what you're saying. That's why you're hearing a pause on my part. And I'm thinking a little bit about even some of the stuff, maybe you're a fan or not, but I was just thinking about some of the stuff Rob Bell has talked about when got him in a little bit of trouble with some people about that resurrection and that tearing down. And there is many, not only the story of Jesus, but you see throughout Scripture sort of this dying and bringing to life, dying and bringing to life, dying and bringing to life. It's a consistent story throughout all of Scripture in a different sort of way. I think it's important to bring that out. But when you hear some of these voices come out and talk in a negative, condemning tone in the Christian leadership position, talking the way that they do, that causes a lot of anger for a lot of other people out there. How do you personally respond to that, and how? And I guess does it make your work tougher to talk about this, or how do you respond?
I would say yes. It makes my job harder because those are the voices that often get heard the most. Mm-hmm. And when I hear those voices, and kind of picking up on what Keiko said, these are people who know that their way of life, their way of understanding the world is dying, and death is difficult, and they can't see the resurrection around it. And so what they see is what they are losing, and what they're losing is influence and privilege and power, and they're responding with a lot of hostility. It's kind of like what we heard yesterday watching the Kavanaugh stuff, to bring that back. People getting very angry about being called to account, about even being told they're doing something wrong, and they respond very, very negatively to that. And when folks lash out at something like Rob Bell, very good at what he does. He's not saying anything new. He just says it better than the rest of us.
Yeah.
And when folks pile on him, it's mainly because he's the target. And there's a lot of angry voices out there because they are losing what they once had, and they're lashing out. And and anger, of course, gets the most attention.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with what Kevin said. I feel like it offers us a choice do we go down this path knowing that, naming these truths could bring a lot of heat and lead to some really challenging places. But I try to trust in the fact that that's my job, and then that there's going to be some support from God in trying to name these things and create space for these things, as uncomfortable as it may make me, and definitely as uncomfortable as it makes others, and try to do that well, knowing that that's the way through this, is by naming it and talking about it, and trying to use our vocabulary and our framework to frame that and show that it doesn't have to be like this. We don't need to live this way. and that there is life on the other side.
It's an interesting question. How does it affect us personally? Because as a woman, there's no point at which I can say, okay, my professional work around sex abuse and all this stuff is done now. I'm just going to go home and play with my kids, and I don't have to think about it. As a woman, that it is personal. It's always personal. Part of my response when people do say these things to me is generally people who are conservative don't talk to me. As a professional, they've already kind of made their decision. But one of the other things that I do, and I'm very deliberate about it, is when I'm out in public, as a pastor, I wear my clerical collar. And I do it as a visual sign that there are clergy out there who are women. And my hope is that it signals to the world that there are churches, there are congregations that are different, that are not holding to these more conservative, louder voices. And it's a quiet thing to wear a clerical collar. I don't march around announcing to people that I'm a feminist pastor. But at the same time, you know, that's the way that I engage. Because like I said, generally people don't come up to me and say, hey, did you hear what that really conservative person said about women or about men? Because they know that I didn't actually listen.
Nicholas, you wrote recently at the Pride Festival that you did that as well. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, that's sorry, who are you talking to?
No, go ahead.
Oh, did both of you do that?
I did that. I'm glad to hear lots of people are doing that. So that's the second year that there's been a Lutheran contingent in the Calgary Pride Parade, and I have walked in the San Francisco Pride Parade with the Lutheran contingent in San Francisco a number of years ago, and it's a very moving experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very difficult experience because I am well aware that as a Christian, as a pastor, there have been people who have gone before me as pastors who have said incredibly traumatizing things to people in the LGBTQ community. Mm-hmm. And so I'm aware that when I am there, I'm not necessarily welcome. And I accept that. And I am not there to evangelize in the sense of you should all become Christians. I'm there to evangelize in the sense of going out there and saying, God loves you. Christ loves you. You're made in the image of God. But, you know, the troubling thing is there are other Christians there. There have been Christians at the parade, not in the parade, but at the parade, who have their posters and their signs and their horrible things that they're saying. And, you know, it's difficult because as a Christian, I'm a minority in that parade, but that's a really good place for me to be as a Christian.
Yeah, my experience was really similar where and likewise, I knew my collar can trigger people. And so I had to have some conversations with friends in the LGBTQ community about, can I do this? And what do I need to think about? And how does this work? And ended up deciding to wear it, knowing the same tensions that you just mentioned. But it was such a meaningful experience because all the churches were towards the end of the Calgary Pride Parade. And it was my first time marching in the parade in that capacity. And it was beautiful to see the response where people cheered and they came up and said, thank you. They came up and said, we didn't know there were churches out there where we could go to. And that was meaningful to me because it offered a counter narrative that they've received for so many years. And are receiving during the parade where people show up to protest with their big signs saying that God hates them. But if we could be in that parade, even just offer the smallest signs that is, no, you are loved just as you are. that God loves you, that you are welcome in these places to explore your spirituality. I'll bend over backwards to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my experience was similar. One highlight for me, that was my first time as well, marching in Calgary Pride or any Pride. But beforehand, and the United Church, because maybe your folks organized this, was Holy Communion.
Yeah.
Was helping preside over that as the whole group, as well as being able to distribute the elements as part of the group. And I found that incredibly meaningful, is to bring the sacrament to that environment and to show God's love in a very edible way to people who wanted to receive. And that's something that specifically the church does. And we're able to do and be the church in that place and at that moment. And I found that incredibly meaningful. And going through the parade and seeing people cheer and that sort of thing, I had a similar response. I found it quite emotionally overwhelming at some point, at points, because of the history of the church with that community and them allowing us to be part of that, and recognizing that we can be, partners together, and that not all churches are a threat. In fact, a lot of churches are very welcoming and affirming. And I found that, I just found it a wonderful experience.
And I also would imagine, and for all three of you, there is that contingent of Christianity out there that question your faith or question who you are and question what you're doing. So, I mean, there's that one challenge within the LGBT community to create partnership, create connection. But at the other end of that is the face of hostility towards taking a step towards supporting that community as well. So I mean, for me, I think that I commend you for doing that. I think that's a very courageous thing, in my opinion, anyway. I want to end off and talk a little bit about language. And the topic I wanted to start with, and then was corrected on, is I wanted to use the word forgiveness. And I was corrected on that by Keiko. And let's talk about this concept of confession. Where does this fit in this? How does this play in to that? And why is it important?
Well, I think, it's not that I want to get rid of forgiveness, but I think it's such a loaded word. Mm-hmm. And I think Christians don't do a very good job, actually, of defining what it is. And too often, by jumping to forgiveness, there's this implication that we're over it. We're over whatever happened, and we're ready to move on. And forgiveness isn't about just forgetting and moving on. So, and I know that I'm sure all of us could probably agree that that's not what it is, but that's sort of, I think, what still sits in our culture. And more to the point, there can't be forgiveness without confession first. In the Lutheran liturgical tradition, there's a confession and forgiveness at the beginning of the service, and it starts with confession. And it's a group confession. We all say the same words. But I think that one of the things that I've learned in the recent years with the Truth and Reconciliation movement is that confession comes first. Corporate confession of our sins, of my sins, of all of that, which is really just the lifting the veil on what's happened. That has to come first before we can talk about forgiveness, and that hasn't happened yet. So we're not ready yet to move to forgiveness.
Yeah, agreed. The word that came to my mind too was repentance, which I think would needs that confessional aspect of it in order for us to go back to the way that God is calling us to live. We need to rumble with what is going on and what are those systemic sins that are woven into some of our DNA woven into our institutions and our culture. We need to name them and wrestle with them before we can call it a day.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of that return back to that's that repentant act, I think.
Mm-hmm. To recognize our full complicity. I don't think we're there yet. I know I certainly am not. Because the system is so part of like the whole fish in the water sort of thing, doesn't know it's there. We're so immersed in it that we don't often see how deep it goes. And talking with my LGBTQ plus friends and colleagues and parishioners, I'm always learning something because their experience is so other than mine that I need to listen and hear that in order to recognize where I'm still complicit in that area, as well as areas of race and gender and those sorts of things. It's an ongoing act of repentance. And reconciliation and forgiveness, it can be there, but that's also ongoing as we learn, as we grow with each other.
I guess for me, why those words came up for me was because when we have these conversations, it is the attacker that we're putting the redemption story on, or trying to give the second chance to, or putting the forgiveness, redemption, second chance label around the person that has done the attacking. But I don't hear a lot of language around the survivor, or the person that had this happen to them. And I've been really struggling with that. I'm like looking for specific language, but like for me, the redemption, like in my personal opinion, that when Christ died on the cross and rose from the dead, it was a redemption for them too. It's not because they deserve that they sinned. That's not what I'm saying, but like, where's that sort of redemption component, or not? You know what I mean? Like the language that we use to the people that were attacked. It doesn't, like, we're not giving that voice to them. We're interested, for some reason, a voice like Gian Gomeshi gets to write in the New Yorker, but we don't hear from those that have survived this. And I'm just wondering how that changes a bit. And I think confession is part of it, but that's what I've been really struggling with.
I think for me, what comes to mind when you're using the word redemption is sort of the idea of the more nuanced Greek around the word salvation that includes healing. And that, to me, giving victims or survivors a voice in the church is really important if they do want to speak, because it's in speaking and in being heard by others that healing begins to happen. Because so much of what happens with sex abuse is the silence around it. It's the silence that just makes it particularly traumatizing, because they can't talk. And I even believe that in congregations where there are witnesses to sexual abuse, particularly with clergy, and those witnesses or those people who know, they're not allowed to talk, and there's a secondary traumatization going on there. So for me, it's about allowing these people to be heard, and in being heard, they're recognized, that shame is removed, and God makes them whole. Not forgives them, like I see where your trouble is with the language, and not redeems them quite, because again, I see the trouble there, but that wholeness.
Yeah, my mind went to this Hebrew word that we use sometime, and that, like, it's tikud, and it's that a word for expressing pain, but it gets at this idea of communal healing that happens when marginalized voices are brought in to share their wounds that many of us don't have, in this movement to recognize that we're not whole and healed as a community if one person is left out. And how do we what part of redemption is corporate and communal, and how do we think about redemption kind of in that way? But we need to go through these things together in order to reach that stage where we can actually call ourselves redeemed.
I do want to raise a concern that I have with that, though. And I'm sure this is something that you've thought about, but I always want to be careful that we don't encourage victims to speak up because it's good for everybody.
Oh,
and
sure.
I don't think that's what you're saying, but there is that temptation when we talk about the wholeness of the community to reinscribe again the good of the community over the good of the individual. So we've got to be really careful about how we frame that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I think that goes back to your point earlier of these aren't our stories to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we side with victims of abuse who aren't ready to share those stories and make sure we don't add further abuse by forcing them to tell their story or telling it for them. Excellent point.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of justice. What does that look like in that context? Justice for the victim, justice for the survivor, justice for the abuser. That word takes on different tones when it's applied to different people. What role does that play in both the personal and the communal healing? And I think it starts with the victim and the survivor deciding what justice looks like, as well as the community deciding what justice looks like, but also with the victim or the survivor being the first to name the pain of what needs justice from or out of. So that's a theme that I think is important to recognize in looking at issues of healing and reconciliation and forgiveness and even confession.
Yeah, it's something there's a lot there. There's a lot to, just really important stuff to unpack on that. And I'm not saying, it's a lot of good things that were said there that I think are really important for people to think. And I also, even in community, it's I guess it's so important to really, what you said, that are a lot of things I've liked what you said, but it's really important it's not our story, it's their story, and it's on their time that they do whatever they need to do to go forward. Whatever that looks like, that's theirs if it's not ours. And that's a good takeaway. That's one thing I'm taking away anyway. Is there anything else we want to cover before we end this off, or?
There's always more to say.
Probably
is. For hours.
Yes.
Yeah, we're preachers.
Yeah, that's true. You guys can do a whole sermon. I think we've given a lot to unpack at this point, but maybe for you guys, just kind of tell us a little bit. I read your bios, but maybe from your perspective, what are you guys up to? Tell us about where we can find you, if on social media, etc., about what your church is up to, things like that. And now you're all silent.
Okay, sure. Well, I have a blog where I post my sermons. It's not very fascinating, but it's keiko.blogspot.ca. So that sermon that I referenced earlier is up there. I'm not on social media. Well, I am, but only for a very small group. And I have a chapter in a book coming out in January that deals specifically with the 8th commandment, which is thou shalt not bear false witness, and looking at that and really unpacking it to understand how can we apply that to sex abuse and what does that actually mean for those of us who are in positions of authority. So that's coming out in January. It's called the Subaltern Luther. And in our church, we're just sort of working on creating this culture, and I'm beginning to do some work on what it means to be a trauma-informed community. And what does that look like for a congregation to be a space where we understand the long-term consequences of trauma? And I think from there, I'm hoping it will open up into larger conversations.
Awesome. Whoever's next.
I can go. Most of my stuff you can find at my blog, nickacoates, COATES.com. That's where I generally post my sermons and the occasional article that I write. And if you're interested in having more conversations about the intersection of sex and spirituality, my friend Jill and I have a podcast called Prayer and Private Parts, and that's at prayerandprivateparts.com.
And I listened to a bit. It's quite a fascinating. Jill has been on my I've known Jill, and Jill has been on the podcast before. So Jill's a wonderful human being, well respected.
Yes.
Yeah, you can. My blog, it's in process, but it's kevolution.ca, or you can get my sermons and such at makingfaithmatter.ca, which is First Lutheran Church's website. And at First Lutheran, we chose that as our tagline, mainly because we're building on our outreach to the community. We have tax clinics with low-income people at 12 different libraries around the city. And if you want to volunteer with us, just hit us up on the website. We also have an app for your phone. You can listen to my sermons and all that sort of good stuff on your phone. And if I'm on Twitter at POWE2550. I just got that at the beginning when Twitter first started, and I've never changed it. So, yeah.
Of course, you can find me on Facebook, Kevin Olenek, Twitter, KEVULE, Spreaker.com, where all of the podcasts are, iTunes, Agree or Disagree the Podcast, YouTube, Kevin Olenek, etc., etc. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Friday to join, and thank you so much. I think that this was a really important conversation that this sounds corny in some ways how I say it, but if it impacts one person, then I think that a job has been done. So I really appreciate and respect what you guys have done, and I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
Thank you. And thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, of course, contact them, and we will talk to you all very soon. Bye for now.